Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us either on Zoom or on Facebook Live. My name is Allison Dirk. I am the director at the Eugene V. Debs Museum, and with our usual in-person programming coming to a halt due to the pandemic, the Debs Foundation and Museum have been hosting virtual activities, tours, and different presentations to help keep Debs's legacy of social criticism alive during what has been such a difficult time for so many of us. We've gotten pretty creative, and you can check out our earlier programming on our website, our YouTube channel, and our Facebook page. Now, today's presentation is yet another creative reworking of what was intended to be an in-person event to be held at the museum in Terre Haute at the end of March 2020. Well, we all know what happened at the end of March 2020, but our guest speaker has graciously adapted her presentation for this virtual format. And for accessibility purposes, a captioned recording of this event will be available on our YouTube channel and our website within a week or so. And parts of this presentation are interactive, and you'll notice Cindy asking you questions from time to time. Now, please answer those questions in the chat if you're with us on Zoom, or in the comments section if you're over on Facebook. And there will be time for Q&A after the presentation, so please drop your questions in the chat or the comments at any time you like. To support the museum and the foundation and to help keep the Debs legacy alive, you can support our work with a one-time or recurring monthly donation over at donate.debsfoundation.org. So now I will introduce our speaker, who is joining us today from Pelham, New Hampshire. In 2014, Cindy Ringer spotted a genealogist ad seeking to buy old letters. Cindy had many old letters from around the turn of the 20th century. Her grandmother had found them in a trunk when she bought a house in Lynn, Massachusetts. Eventually, she gave them to Cindy's mother, who handed them down to her. Upon showing the letters to this genealogist, they both agreed that the letters represent an important piece of American history. And so began Cindy's research journey. Over 6 years have passed, during which Cindy has researched every nook and cranny, seeking to find as much information as she can about the remarkable woman who received these letters. Cindy anticipates bringing to life a piece of history about a forgotten comrade. Thanks for joining us, Cindy.
Thank you, Allison, for that introduction. I'm going to start with sharing my screen. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. Allison, you'll let me know if they can't see that first screen. And before I do start going into my slideshow, I have to comment that this presentation was written in 2019, well before the turmoil of 2020. And as I reviewed my presentation, I found that so much of the information and incidents that occurred in 2020, I felt like it gave me a much better understanding and a better connection to actually what Margaret lived through during her lifetime. And I'm hoping those listening in today can relate to some of these, as I call it, echoes from the past and see some parallels with today, which is what I've seen. And also, please know that after today's presentation, you will know more about Margaret than all of the world's historians know about her and that's ever been printed about her. So I need to take you on a journey. This is what I call a journey of interest and fascination as I share about my discoveries about this woman, who I feel is worthy of being recognized for her dedication to the political party, which stood up for some of the rights that we have today as United States citizens. And I also feel what better venue, my first public presentation about Margaret, than through the Eugene V. Debs Museum and Foundation. I feel very honored to have had this opportunity put before me, and thank you again to the Foundation. First, I need to start with giving everyone a bird's eye view of what socialism in the United States stood for at the turn of the 20th century, so that we all have an understanding of that. So the Socialist Platform around 1900 stood up for various rights, and the ones that have come to fruition. The The first one is child labor laws. Prior to that, there were no child labor laws, and socialists wanted children to be at least 14 years old to be able to work. This was during the industrialization era, and many children were, used in labor in the factories because they were small stature, and the machinery was large, but individuals, adults, couldn't get into the machinery to maybe unjam it or fix it. So children were often sent in to repair the machinery. And I'm sure some children lost their lives. As you can see, this child here is probably about 10 years old, and he's lost his finger because of working. The other thing that socialists were advocates of was for children to have education up to the age of 14. Now, there was schooling around the country, but it was a state to state schooling. So some states had it, some didn't. Socialists wanted it to be a national program where all children up to the age of 14 would be educated. Another thing they stood for was an 8-hour workday. Now, as you know today, it's not necessarily 8 hours. I know myself, I work what's called a 980 shift, where I get every other Friday off. I know many people that work 12-hour shifts, but basically what socialists stood for was just to at least have only an 8-hour day and not to be working. They were working like 6 days a week, and they would work 12 or 14 hours a day. So they were hard workers, and they just felt they had deserved some free time off. The other thing they advocate for was, of course, voting, and not just for women to get the vote. This was during the suffragist period, but they felt that it shouldn't matter not just your sex, but it shouldn't matter what your religion, your skin color, your creed was, as long as you were a US citizen. They felt you should have the ability to vote. They also were pro for national insurance. We had no national insurance, and what would happen is men who were mostly in the workforce, but whoever was in the workforce would have an accident. They wouldn't be able to return to work, and then their families wouldn't be able to pay the bills. They wouldn't be able to afford food. And as you know today, we have workmen's compensation as well as unemployment insurance for these situations. And another thing that they advocated, originated the fight for, was Social Security and Medicare. They felt that we should have some kind of retirement so people did not have to work basically until they died. And the final slide picture I have here is they advocated equal pay for equal work. And this, as you can see, is a more current slide, definitely. There is still a controversy about women specifically, but also others having equal pay for equal work. And I want to show you that later on you'll see that the socialists did not just talk the talk, they actually walked the walk, as I call it. So how does Margaret Hale fit into this historical picture, and who exactly is she? Well, Margaret was a political activist, very active for these socialist causes that I just mentioned on the prior slide. During a very tumultuous time in North America, she was active between the years of 1894 and 1902 and beyond. She was amongst the few women that were in the forefront of fighting for all of these rights. There were many women that were active, but they maybe were behind the scenes. They would run fundraisers or have picnics, etc. Margaret wasn't behind the scenes. She was right out there in the front. And historians, unfortunately, have barely acknowledged her active involvement, even though she was not a hidden figure. And she did have her private life, but as far as her public life, she was definitely out there and amongst the socialist organization. Now, I do not know Margaret's exact year of birth, but my research has indicated that she was born between 1865 and 1872. So there's no way of my telling Margaret's story without bringing you back to your thoughts, at least back to this era during which she lives in America. And what I'm going to ask you is, what was going on in 1865? I'm going to pause. I'm going to, if you can put something into the chat, anyone who knows what comes to your mind when we say the year 1865.
And Kenny in Zoom said the Civil War. Reconstruction was another answer we got.
Yep.
The end of the American Civil War.
Yep. So that's exactly right. Spring of 1865, the Civil War ends in the United States. States, slavery abolished, and 4 million enslaved people are freed. And as someone else mentioned, the Reconstruction period begins very immediately after that. It's very active. And by the 1870s, the United States is entering into a very volatile time period in that what's happening is our economy is also evolving away from farming and towards industrialization. And what this means is people are flocking to cities because of the industrialization. That is where the jobs are. Large factory buildings are going up. And because of that, we then also get tenement housing. Now, as you may imagine, the tenement housing didn't have storage. People were living in close living quarters, close proximity to each other. And it just wasn't a pleasant environment. So along with all these things, you have the long work hours, the unsafe working conditions. People were not getting paid well, and the jobs were dangerous, and children were working at these laborious jobs. Now, as a result of this, what also happened is people began feeling like the government wasn't going to help them at all. In July of 1876, they formed the Working Men's Party. And within a year from that time, and sometime in 1877, they changed their name to the Socialist Labor Party. And that's how the first Socialist, the SLP, was formed. It came originally from the Working Men's Party. And this is the emblem for this party. By the 1880s, they were pretty much well established, and they had this emblem with the man's working arm type of thing. And I'm just going to mention that they became, around the 1890s, they became under the influence of Dan DeLeon, who headed up this party. And I'm going to talk more about Dan in a minute. But first, I need to get back to Margaret. And what I need to tell you, because I'm going chronologically, by the way, I found this to be the best way to run this presentation. So the year now is 1894. And Margaret makes what I call her debut appearance. What it is she is the first woman allowed a woman's column in an English language socialist publication. And this is something that's unique, and that she's the first woman allowed this. The publication is called Justice, and is published out of Providence, Rhode Island. I believe that Margaret lived right in Providence. She definitely lived in Rhode Island. And what is interesting, one interesting comment I'd like to make is Mary Jo Buell, who authored a book and mentions Margaret in it. She said that the woman's column, Margaret said, was to talk about things and explain them in our own way and see how they affect us and what we're going to do about it. So I mention that because I think that shows you that Margaret was definitely embraced the idea of women working and women coming into the working sectors. Also, I think that it shows that she was, all about the women evolving to being independent and being able to be free of beings and support themselves. At the same time, between the years 1894 and 1896, Margaret is the SLP state secretary for Rhode Island. So that's her debut appearance. I'm going to go a little bit back here. This is 1890, but this is Dan DeLeon, and he is the head of the SLP for a good 20 years after, from 1890 onward. And what about Dan that's interesting is his leadership style. He does not tolerate any deviation or any questioning of his authority. Dan is viewed as a chief prophet, so much so that some people viewed him as making the SLP into a mystic cult rather than a political party. And he's viewed as this chief prophet, as I mentioned, and he loses some people feel that he loses contact with the real world and real people. And I just find that pretty interesting. What happens within the SLP organization is there, between the years 1895 to 1896, there is a continuing tension, this rising tension. And some of it has to do with Dan's leadership style, but also with other issues within the organization that I'll be going over in a few minutes. Now, this one area that I want to talk about with this tension is a little background. What happens here is the SLP has this, their national newsletter is called The People. This is the head of it, like the top of it. And this publication is, like I said, published around the whole country. And it just happens that in Massachusetts, the chapters in Massachusetts, they decide they also want this publication to have some local news. So what they do is they print a page or two of local socialist news that they think would interest the local people, and they put it onto the end of this newsletter, this newspaper called The People. They just kind of tack it on the end, and that then goes to only to the Massachusetts chapters. And this here is pretty interesting in that Dan DeLeon is not happy about this. He feels that, this is not, they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. And he actually coins the term fakedom, which I find interesting. It reminds me, I have to admit, of fake news, but that is a term that he coined. And in retaliation, what Dan does is he develops a scheme. And his scheme is to expel two very prominent members of the Boston area local SLP chapters. And it happens that one of the members is the pastor, Herbert Casson. And I know that Margaret has a close relationship with the Casson family. And Herbert Casson was a pastor, like I said, of the Lynn Labor Church. And just to point, to understand the relationship here, Margaret, I know, is very close with Jean Culver Casson. I have a letter from Jean that she's written to Margaret that Margaret kept. And Jean is married to Charles Wesley Casson, who happens to be the brother of Herbert Casson. So this is the relationship. So Margaret definitely knows Herbert, and Herbert's trying to be, Dan DeLeon's trying to expel Herbert from the SLP. And another thing that I found interesting was in June 28th, specifically 1896, Margaret spoke at the Lynn Labor Church. The title of her speech was Double Standard of Morality. And she spoke for Herbert Casson. He happened to be resting in Londonderry, New Hampshire, which is the next town over from where I live, ironically. And Lynn is where I found the letters. That's where I grew up, was where these letters were actually originally found. So I have a couple of excerpts from this speech because I found them very interesting. I thought that people could relate them a little bit to today's environment and what's happening today. So I just have them here. And the first one is, since they insist upon a double standard of morality, one for the rich and powerful, one for the poor, we shall take the liberty of setting up our own standard. And then the next one is, those who are luxuriating at our expense are not going to make any change. Their hearts cannot be touched by our story of our sufferings. There is nothing in them to respond. Their eyes are blind to the misery they cause. Their ears are deaf to cries of pain. Their hearts are hard as ever Pharaoh's was. It is we ourselves who must free ourselves. And then there's more. This is just excerpts, but there's one more that I like. That same speech, but this is, I think, towards the end of her speech. She said this. She said, "You, the working men, with a voice in the conduct of affairs, it is you who must do this thing. It is you who suffer, who must do and care. You who feed the world, who clothe the world, who are the world, who shall stand up and say, in our might, not one shall lack food, not one shall be cold, not one shall fall short of his full inheritance as a human heir in this our day." So I just found that interesting. Her speech was, this was again in 1896, she's saying this. So now we go forward 1 year to June of 1897. And what happens here is the SLP membership, they become more and more discontent. And one of the major controversies that develops now is over the approach on how to make socialism become mainstream throughout the country, how to promote it, right? How to get people to join and be active with it. And these differences escalate enough that members leave the SLP and they join, a new organization is formed, and that new organization is called the Social Democracy of America. And this is their abbreviation, is SDA, and this is their emblem here that they chose. Now Margaret joins the SDA, so she leaves the SLP and she joins the SDA. Unfortunately, discontent quickly mounts within this newly established party. And what's happened here, to explain to the people watching this, so you understand, there's two factions within the party, and they can't work out an agreement. So what plagues the Socialist Party is this belief of what should be the platform of the party. The one platform is what's called colonization, and they call the people the colonizers, or also known as the cooperative commonwealth. And the other faction is known as political scientists, or political socialists. And so you understand this a little bit more, the colonizers wanted to launch a series of colonies, and they felt that would build socialism by example, such that eventually an entire state would become a cooperative commonwealth, and then this whole idea would spread from state to state. So when I say they want to build a series of colonies, it's exactly as you think. They want to buy land, they would live off the land, they would, share the wealth of the land with everyone. Whereas the scientific socialists, also known as the political scientists, they felt that you had to become mainstream, you had to go to the voting booth, and you had to elect socialists into government positions. So their basic belief was, the government as it was in the United States, leave it as it is, but elect socialists into these positions. And so that you are aware, Margaret was a scientific socialist, or also known as political scientist, and she happens to be recognized in more than one book by an action that she initiates at the second SDA convention, which convenes on June 7th, 1898. So this convention, what happens here that's interesting, this convention is from June 7th to the 11th, 1898, and it's in Chicago, Illinois. And what happens is so interesting is the colonizers, they form what's called paper chapters. So a couple of weeks before the convention, they go around the Chicago area and they form these chapters, brand new membership. And they do this so that they get more votes for colonization. Because these are new members, they're kind of swaying them. They're telling them, come to this convention. It's right here in Chicago. And then they talk them into, voting for the colonization. And Margaret shows up for the convention on the first day, and she is, just to point out, she's one of very few female candidates. I don't know delegates, I should say. And she is one of very few female delegates that are there. She's representing the state of Massachusetts. And so you have to picture, this is a room of 100 to 120, mostly men. And she's outraged. She thinks this is a scheme, of course, which it is, to get the colonization votes. So she stands up and she gives a fiery speech in front of all these men. And she declares and says that she is going to leave the conference and she's going to leave the organization even. And that she'll take the state's delegation, which is Massachusetts, with her, which has a very good delegation. There's a lot of socialist membership is in Massachusetts. And as it happens that Margaret actually did not get up and walk out on June 7th. Her speech did cause a delay. There was a discussion, and it does end up that the executive board decides to allow these paper chapters to vote. Now, even though they felt that this obviously wasn't a good thing, the political scientists decided, well, we're here, might as well stay here, till we take the vote, because you never know, they might get the vote the way they want it to be, which is they want the platform to have socialists go, be nominated for offices in the United States government and vote for people to vote them in office. So they decide to stay and see how this is going to play out. 4 days later, now they go through all these other topics, their finances, etc. So now it's on the floor about what is the platform of this socialist organization going to be. They have hours of heated debate, and it's actually right before 3 a.m. They take a vote. So it's 3 a.m. in the morning. They take a vote. Are we going to do what they call a colonization, or are we going to do this scientific approach? And as it turns out, of course, the colonizers did win the vote. And when that happened, Margaret and 32 other political scientists get up and they walk out. They walk across the street. Now I'm just thinking this is 3 a.m. They go to a hotel called Revere Hotel, and in the hotel, they form a new party called the Social Democratic Party, and it's SDP for short. So now we have this new party. This is their new emblem. and it's called the SDP. Now, this party here is the executive board of the SDP that's formed. Eugene Debs is his picture in the upper left-hand corner. He is on the executive board of this new party. And I want to point out Victor Berger across from Eugene Debs on the right side, because Victor Berger's mentioned in my presentation a couple of times. One point, he offers Margaret a job. So because I think this is a little confusing, at least I know I found this very confusing when I was even writing my presentation, I have a quick review slide just so that we all understand these different parties and organizations. So we have the Socialist Labor Party. That was the first one with Dan DeLeon. And then this SDA was formed, and Margaret joined the SDA, called the Social Democracy of America. And then she joins and she helps to form the SDP, Social Democratic Party of America. And I need to tell you that's not the last party. There's still another one coming up. So just so that you see where we're all at. So now over the following 3 years, we're talking about the years 1898 to 1901. Margaret doesn't fulfill, as I mentioned before, your typical woman's role with running picnics and bake sales and fundraisers. Her official title is Massachusetts State Secretary for the SDP. And this carries with it some other work that she does. Unofficially, she ends up being a tour coordinator. So when other socialists come, like Eugene Debs or whoever would come from another area, she would give them tours around Massachusetts and help them with that. She's a campaign manager. She would help with campaigning when they're running for office. She also was a chief recruiter, always recruiting new people. And she also, this is all informally, she was a reporter. She did a lot of writing, a lot of submissions, various writings, like I mentioned, the speeches, etc. Now, in the letters that I have, she's referred to by someone as a boss organizer. She's also referred to as organizer of Victory in Massachusetts. And in a publication published in 1900, she's called the coordinating force of the Massachusetts movement. So I do feel if you see these things, you can see she definitely was out there in the forefront and people did know her. But that's not the end. I also have a letter from Elizabeth Thomas, who is another female socialist that was very active with the Socialist Party. And what's interesting is in the letter that I have, what Elizabeth Thomas writes to Margaret. She says, Comrade Berger is still swaying me to come to Milwaukee and assures me that if I do, I will become the Margaret Hale of the West, but I'm not so sure of that, ! So she refers to Margaret Hale of the West, or Berger refers to that. And in my eyes, that means she was seen as Margaret Hale of the East. So I found that pretty interesting. Now, the next thing that happens, we're going chronologically, in early 1900, the Socialist Party talks about unification of all these parties. As I went through this, there's all those 3 different parties, but there's also other smaller chapters of their own around the country. And talk begins of uniting all these parties, specifically with the SLP is pretty much the biggest one. So they talk about having one cohesive party. I think they feel that it's obviously would give them some more leverage and some better influence if they were all united and together. And what's interesting is I have a letter that was from the mayor of Haverhill, and in that letter, he talks about saying to Margaret, why are you against this idea of unification? And when I first read it and I kept, researching about this, I thought, yeah, this is weird. Why wouldn't she see that this would mean that they'd have a little more power and a little more clout if they unified? So instead of having these small chapters of different socialist parties, independent ones really from each other, why wouldn't she see this? And then as I studied this more and more, I kind of actually changed my thoughts in that I thought, well, can you really blame her when you think of how she left the other party because of the platform controversy? And that was only 2 years earlier. So it wasn't like a lot of time had passed. And the second party she was involved with, she'd only been there for a year. From SLP to the second party. She was only there involved with that party for a year. So I can see why she would think that way. And what's interesting too is she actually fights against this idea of unification. And what she does is she traverses around the state of Massachusetts and goes to chapters, meetings, and chapter after chapter, she speaks against it. She speaks against United, and she says, no, I don't think it's a good idea. And then what I think is very ironic is she actually goes along with it in the end. And the reason I know that is because she becomes one of 9 members of what they call the Unification Committee. So each of these separate organizations sent had a unification committee, and they sent them all to the what they call the Joint Unity Convention of the Socialist Party, which was held in the summer of 1901 in Indianapolis. And I know that she was a member of this because of this picture that happens to, this is July 29th, 1901. This picture happens to be at the Eugene V. Debs, I don't know if it's the original, but there's the actual picture there at the Eugene Debs Museum. And in this picture, I put these square boxes around the people I found to be women because I really felt like it's like a Finding Waldo picture. It's kind of tough to see. There might be some women that I missed, I will admit, but these are the 3 that definitely are women. And I feel that Margaret is the person on the furthest right that is in a red box, although it could be one of the other women in that picture. So this Unity Convention, now we have another socialist party, but it's a combination of these, as I said, they unified into what was called the Socialist Party of America, or SPA for short, SPA. And obviously, Margaret had a major role in helping to organize this party. And this is their emblem, the handshake. Now, my next slide brings me into 1902. And what I say about 1902 is this is what brought Margaret to her most notable fame. If you go to Wikipedia and you put in Margaret Hale, you will see what it says there about her. There's not much there, but it tells you that she goes to Canada. And for that reason, I do believe she was a Canadian citizen. And the Canadian Socialist League nominates Margaret for a legislative representative position. And what's so interesting about this is that the first thing is women in Canada didn't get the right to vote till 1917. It's a couple of years before us in America did. And also, the laws of Canada said that a female could not hold this legislative position. It could not be held at all. And the Canadian Socialist League found a loophole in the law. And the loophole was that did not say that a woman could not be nominated for the position. So the Canadians decided to nominate Margaret Hale. And obviously, she went along with it, which I think is a great thing. And as I mentioned, this is 1902, and this is her campaign picture. I think it was drawn from the other picture that was on my very first slide. And just to let you know, in Canada, it was similar to the United States, very similar in that women were not at the forefront of the socialist organization. They did have a magazine called Citizens and Country that women would help to sell, and that would be used to educate people on socialism. But they pretty much had a similar role as the women in the United States. And I think that Margaret doing this, letting herself be nominated, shows her willingness and desire to basically carve a niche for women in the political arena. She did feel women could hold political office. And in Canada, I also want to say it was very similar in that socialism up there in Canadian didn't show any lines. They didn't have any, it was the same basic platform in that they didn't feel that your sex or your nationality or your skin color should impair you from running for office or be in this position. And she actually had very many female reformers and suffragists support her. And what was interesting, one comment I like to make too, is that a Canadian suffragist spoke of Margaret being in support of the principles of socialism and the enfranchisement of women. And what's interesting about that is Margaret, in her response to this, she made it clear to the people that they were talking to that she is a socialist rather than a woman suffrage candidate. And what she said is she agreed that women should have the franchise, but only as a step toward the ultimate goal of socialism. So I point that out because being a suffragist was very popular. That was, a lot around the world. Women were fighting to get the vote. And Margaret did believe that the woman should be allowed to vote, but she really was a big advocate of the other avenues of socialism, which that even Black people should be allowed to vote, and Black women, and just all nationalities, and everyone should have equal rights in that regard. So I just found that pretty interesting. And I just want to show you the campaign flyer. As you can see, this is the Socialist flyer, and Margaret's at the bottom. She was running for North Toronto legislative office, and then these are the others that were running for the other positions in the Toronto area. So that was the campaign flyer there. And what happened here was, as I mentioned, women didn't have the vote. So Margaret did get votes. She actually got 81 votes. So 81 men voted for Margaret. And again, as I mentioned, women didn't get the vote until 1917, so we know it was men. And this here, if you were to read this short article, it does point out basically the socialists did this because they were just trying to educate the voters to the true meaning of socialism. They wanted them to, socialism to become more well-known to the general public. So that is part of why they did what they did, and including Margaret, so that people would have a better understanding of what socialism stood for. I want to also point out on this slide, if you look on the left-hand side where it's like the candidates' names, you see H. Gaylord Wilshire. He got the most votes, 425 votes. And I point him out because Margaret actually ends up working for Gaylord. He has a magazine called the Wilshire Magazine. I don't know exactly when she started working for him. I'm sure it was, if she was not working for him at this point in time, in 1902, she definitely was working for him in 1903. And the reason I know that is because I have record that in 1903, she actually becomes the associate editor of his magazine. So that's a pretty good high-level position in 1903 for a woman to become the associate editor. I feel that Margaret definitely has a career. She's establishing a true, what I would deem today as a career. And what she also does in 1903, I did find record that she gave 2 speeches, one on April 13th called The Body and Soul of Socialism, and on November 15th, The Earth for the Human Race. Another thing in 1903, it was towards the end of, it was in November 1903, in the Vanguard, she publishes this prayer called the Socialist Prayer. And I'm just going to read this as part of my presentation. And so it gives you an idea of how her viewpoint on socialism is in 1903. It says, "Give us this day our daily bread, O God. Not for my bread alone I selfish pray. Such prayer would never reach thy loving ear. Such prayer my human lips refuse to say. I pray for those whom thou hast given me here, all men and women to be one with me, to soothe, sustain, and comfort, love, and cheer, and draw in loving service nearer thee. My sister suffers in a garret bare. My brothers labor and grow faint and pine. My baby wails for food. I cannot bear it, God, for all the babies in the world are mine. Father, and they are thine. I claim thine aid. Thou must help us in our righteous cause. Make strong our hands to tear oppression down, and build a world according to thy laws. I cannot eat my daily bread alone. Gone none to me if these cannot be fed. Give none to me if these cannot be fed. With them I stand or fall, for we are one. Father, give all of us our daily bread." Margaret Hale. So I feel that gives you a good perspective of where her thoughts were in 1903. Now, January 8th, 1904, this is where I'm going to get into my letters a bit. And what happens here is this is a letter from Victor Berger. I'm going to put out a scan of the letter. So this is Victor is writing to Margaret, And this is where I mentioned, I mentioned he offers her a job. So this is the job offer letter. And it says, "Dear comrade and friend, returning from a trip, I found on my desk an intimation from very good authority. You are to leave the office of Wilshire's magazine. I am sorry and glad to hear this. Sorry because you were doing much good in that position. And glad because I believe that you can do much more good if you will come with us and work in the Middle West." The second part of the letter here. "We are very anxious to get you here in Milwaukee. We have long appreciated your work both in party and journalism, and we need your help in both departments. We are now entering on a vigorous campaign, and I know of no one who can help us more than you, who were called the organizer of victory in Massachusetts, and with reason, for without you, the comrades of Massachusetts would not have been what they were. So I want to make this offer. If you will come to Milwaukee and act as business manager of the Wahrheit and Vorwärts and put into our campaign work as much time as you can spare from these duties, we will pay you $28 a week. We would gladly pay more. We know you." And unfortunately, I'm missing the rest of the letter. But what is fortunate is that I do have this piece of it because, as you can see, they are offering her, it says, "We will pay you $28 a week and we would gladly pay more." So of course I had to look that up. And what I have here is a slide that's from 1905. So this is actually a year later. And you figure she was offered this in January, right, of 1904. She's offered $28 a week. Now, if you take a look at this slide, on the left-hand column, it's the weekly earnings. And you see I did a double underline on the $25 and over. So she's actually at $28. So she's pretty much for that era, well over the $25. And then the next set of columns is all wage earners. So this is in the United States, all wage earners, there's 51,728 wage earners that are earning $25 and over. And if you run your eye over, follow the line over to the right, you'll see the number 217. That's women ages 16 and over that are earning $25 and over. So look at the category she's in. You have to figure that of those 217, some of them are only earning $26, $27, or $25. And how many of them are actually earning $28, we don't know. But I'd like to point that out, that it shows to me, as I mentioned, the socialists are definitely paying her worth. And they're also that she is definitely a career person and that she's doing a good job and she's doing some work that is helpful to the organization. They think highly of her. Now, a week later, January 14th, 1904, this is a letter that's from Gaylord Wilshire, which is her current employer. This is the employer she's leaving. And he's writing to Victor Berger, who is the person that has made this offer to her to work for $28 a week. So I'm just going to read this letter too. It says, "Dear Berger, your telegram to Miss Hale was received and telephoned down to Heron's Place at Metuchen, New Jersey." Please note Heron's Place, Metuchen, New Jersey for a future slide, "where she is spending the week resting. She asked me to wire you as per enclosed copy. She is not very well and possibly will not care to start for a few days as she thinks the rest will do her good. I am very glad that you are going to get her services, as I don't know of anyone who would be so valuable to you on your paper in the movement in Milwaukee. She certainly will always have my best wishes wherever she goes, and whatever I can do for her or you, it is unnecessary to say that I am always at your commands." Now, the next letter is the next day, and this is Gaylord Wilshire now writing to Margaret. And as you can see, it says, "Care Professor George G.D., which is George Heron, Metuchen, New Jersey." And this says, "Dear Miss Hale, I was awfully glad to hear from you with the enclosures from Berger and Debs, which I'm returning here with to you. They certainly are a very good estimate of what you are worth. It seems to me, on the whole, that Berger's proposition would be an exceptionally good one for you, but of course, you know best. It does sound here like Debs might have proposed something different to her, though I don't have a letter from Debs. And the rest of this says, I am sending you a couple of little souvenirs, which I intended to give you last Christmas, but they did not get here in time. I suggest that you send on the locket to Dulcie with my love. When do you think of leaving? I would not start too early if I were you. You did invaluable work in building up Wilshire's magazine, and I shall never forget your faithful and devoted service. With kind regards to Mrs. Drew and yourself, I am faithfully yours, Gaylord Wilshire. So that's the letters from Gaylord. And I brought this one up because also I want to point out Dulcie, a locket to Dulcie. And now we're going to move on and talk about Margaret's private life. As you could see with her, basically her career, she was very active career-wise, very, very busy life. I do have some information. It seems like later in life, she did some teaching possibly. She was on like a school board in Lynn, Massachusetts. And I need to also mention that I have about 60 letters in total. So I had too many letters to put on it and go through for this presentation today. But I also just want to say that most of them mentioned socialism. Definitely her circle of friends was very active with the Socialist Party and socialism. And like all of us, Margaret had a private side to her life. So the next part of my presentation is going to be about her private life. And in doing that, I do have to go back in time a little bit and revisit some chronologically. And I'm going to go, the letters I have are dated between, as I mentioned before, 1894 and 1904. And now I have to go back to 1894 time frame. And I just want to mention too that these letters, I feel that she kept these separate from, because obviously she did a lot of writing. She had a lot of different publications that she submitted to. And I'm sure she had a lot of people writing to her because of her activities as a campaign manager, et cetera. But these were all grouped together. And I feel that these letters had the most significant to her, like the job offer, for example. She, kept that information. And I think that's because that was important to her. And this next letter she kept, I feel, because it was important to her. And the next letter I show you. Before I go into that, though, I need to tell you about her, a little bit about her private life. And what that is her actual legal real name was Isabel McLean, and it was Mrs. Isabel McLean. She actually was married. So Margaret Hale was an assumed name that she took on. And that's a fact that I did not find anywhere else. I find it in my letters, proof that her real name was Isabel McLean. That was her true identity. So as you can imagine, where to find information about her, that seemingly being her married name, I obviously thought Hale might be her maiden name. I did all kinds of research, and I haven't had much luck with that. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment. I'd like you to enter into the chat some ideas on why do you think Margaret, or really Isabel is her name, why would she not have used her true name? Why would she change her name?
So we've got some interesting comments here in Zoom. One possible reason for her changing her name, one person thinks it could have been anti-Irish sentiment. Somebody thinks her family might not have been in favor of her views. Someone suggested that she was fearful of possible violence. Another person thinks maybe she was protecting her family members. Another person thinks she's protecting her family.
Very good, very interesting. The Irish one is interesting, given that I worked in South Boston for many years, and I know that there was different history about the Irish in that area. So that's interesting. And the other information I have is she actually was a mother. And as you may, because I pointed out Dulcie, she had a daughter, and the daughter's name was Dulcie. And I know Dulcie was born October And probably it was 1888. I have one document that says it was 1890. And the information about Dulcie is, that is interesting is the very oldest letter that I have is dated 1894, and it's from an attorney, Frederick Peabody. So, I want to mention, so she kept her daughter hidden. This is 1894. One second here. So here's this letter. This is a handwritten letter. So I'm definitely going to read this one because it's hard to read the writing unless you're familiar with it. So Dulcie at this point is either 4 or she could be 6 years old when this letter was written. And as in the upper left-hand corner, it's pre-printed with Frederick W. Peabody, counselor at law, 39 Court Street. And over to the right is pre-printed the word Boston. And he is filled in October 6, 1894. And what he writes is, Mrs. McLean, dear Madame, I have just received the enclosed note and hasten to assure you that both my wife and I will be glad, and he underlines glad, to be of what service we may. We are boarding at Cambridge with my wife's aunt, and there would be some small expense for the child's board. If you wish to entrust her to us, she will be carefully guarded and receive the best of care. I write in greatest haste. My wife will write as soon as I can see her. My sincerely yours, Frederick W. Peabody. So it's a pretty typical letter. I mean, she's asking someone to watch her child. I think that, that nothing out of the ordinary with that. But if you bring your eyes back to the top of the letter, you can see there's a sentence up there that has been written almost like a kind of an afterthought, right? Like, I didn't think to write this in there. And that's what intrigued me so much and still intrigues me to today, which is what it says. He wrote, please communicate with me before sending the child that I may suggest safest way of evading observation. And I'm just curious, why is she keeping Dulcie hidden from the general population? That's pretty interesting. Why would she do that? So once again, I'm going to pause and see what people think of that. Why would she hide her daughter, Dulcie?
Our first answer, wondering if Dulcie was born out of wedlock. Another person is wondering that too. And somebody else said maybe their lives were in danger or her husband objected to her political activities. Good guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yep, people know. Yep, I don't know. I don't have the answer on any of that, of course. So whatever people think, it's just good to think about and see if we can kind of analyze that.
Yeah.
So I'd want to talk about a few of these letters in general in this regard, talking about her husband. Between the years 1897 and actually 1898, a Will Wallace, I have some letters from a William Wallace, and he is out in Denver, Colorado. He's actually working for the Western Union Telegraph. He's a lineman. And the reason I bring up Will's letters is because he mentions, first, the salutation in the letter is Dear Mrs. Mack, obviously short for McLean. And this one letter dated September 17th has that. And then there's another letter a couple months later where he says, Mack and I were very glad to get at last your letter. And he spells it the same way. Another letter in March of 1898, he says, I am quite ashamed of myself and I will get Mack to kick me when he comes in. So I feel, because again, these are letters she kept. Why would she keep these particular set of letters? I feel Mack could be her estranged husband, that obviously she didn't have some full relationship with him. She was married to him, but they didn't stay together. And thinking that Mack is short for McLean, right? Like people have nicknames. Also, another individual, G. Mack Opine is his name, and he writes a letter in 1899 where he refers to her as Dear Mrs. Mack, which I think even today people know some, nicknames, people go with your last name and they'll shorten it like that. So I just wanted to point that out in regards to, that's the only reference I have that might be to her husband. I was not able to find any information out. I have something that indicates from Dulcie, I think it's her marriage certificate or something, says a York McLean. So the name York is mentioned. Couldn't find the name a York McLean anywhere. So that's kind of interesting information. And I'm thinking that Will Wallace and York McLean were together out there working the lines, the telegraph lines, telephone lines. Now, you may recall a letter that mentioned Elmwood Farm and George Herron. This is a postcard of the house that's on Elmwood Farm and was there. This house was actually torn down about a year ago, which I will say saddened me. This is a little bit, I think the postcard was from 1910, but it gives you a good idea of what the house looked like. And this is in Metuchen, New Jersey. And George Herron, here's a picture of George Herron around the turn of the 20th century. He's the owner of Elmwood Farm. It's a whole separate side story I love to tell about him, but it's about him and not about Margaret. So I won't get into it today. The reason I bring up this is, as you recall, there was a letter that mentioned that Margaret was resting at Elmwood Farm. Well, as it turns out, some of the most entertaining letters I have were written in between May of 1904 and August of 1904, and they're from a Frank M. Moore. And what they are is they're love letters. Frank is a supervisor of Elmwood Farm, and here's one corner of the envelope where you can see he crossed off George Herron's name and he wrote his own name. Back then you didn't need a street address, you just had the city and state, and no zip code, of course. And he wrote these letters to Isabel McLean between, like I said, March of 1904 and September 1904. Now I have one letter, I've taken an excerpt from the letter dated August 25th, 1904, because to me it proves that Isabel McLean and Margaret Hale were the same person. I also have other evidence of that. Things like I have the envelopes to these letters where it's addressed to Isabel McLean, and then you'd open up the letter and you'd see Dear Margaret. And of course, when I first got the letters years ago, before there was even internet really, I questioned that. I thought that was kind of odd, right? I thought, oh, she's got two names. But so here's this letter in Frank's handwriting. And he writes, Darling Isabel McLean, yes, sweetheart, I did forget that Margaret Hale is a different individual from Isabel McLean. It is Isabel McLean whom I love. It is Isabel McLean, the rare, sensitive type of woman who has brought a new knowledge of life into my being. Yes, Margaret Hale, you are a far greater woman than you know, and I have neither fame, nor glory, nor power. I am unknown to the world. So I feel that shows you he's writing that in the same letter. And now I'm concluding my presentation with something that Margaret wrote called The Woman of Tomorrow. And I feel, again, this just shows how forward-thinking of a woman that she really was. And what this says is, the woman of tomorrow was developing other sides of her nature than the wife and mother side, one who was attempting to become an all-round human being. Instead of the one-sided individual she has hitherto been compelled to remain, she feels her individuality more than her sex, her intellect trained, her tastes educated, and all her mental and physical powers developed. She does not believe that life is over for her when she stands at the altar. The new woman believes in being herself right down to the end of life, living out her own personal life. And what Margaret says is, women were moving toward a destiny we of this generation can perceive but dimly. So, in conclusion, I have to tell you that I view Isabel as a woman who was ahead of her time, and I really give her a lot of credit for her endless support to things like an 8-hour workday, to the child labor laws, to national insurance for working people against accidents, and unemployment and Social Security and Medicare. And then before I open up to question and answer, I just have to add the slide, had to add the slide to give special thanks to all the people that are close to me that have helped me with this research, years and years of research. And I really do appreciate your help. Some of you might be on the call today, which would be great. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and enjoyed learning about Margaret. As I've mentioned to some of you, I could talk probably for another 2 hours. There's so many side stories here, but just want to give that special thanks to everyone. Thank you. Now we're going to open this up. I do have a website if you ever want to go and check out what's going on. I am writing a book that will be a historical fiction, really, because I don't know everything about Margaret. But I will not send spam. I would just send you information about future presentations or the publishing of my book. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for an excellent presentation. I learn more every time I listen to this. And we'll move now into question and answer. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat on Zoom or the comment section over on Facebook. We got one question from Tyrene asking, why do you think Margaret Hale isn't more well-known?
Well, I think it's just because, as we know, a lot of women's history was not written about. That's been come out in the past couple of years, that there's so much written in with what women did over the past centuries that has not been written about. And I think that's part of the biggest reason why that has happened with Margaret Hale.
Definitely. David raised their hand, so I'm going to see if I can actually let David talk.
I see him. He's on mute, though. Right, gotta unmute him.
Yep, David, you'll have to unmute yourself if you'd like to talk. We'll come back to you if you're able to unmute. Julie asks if there are any heirs still alive.
So her daughter Dulcie did have 2 children, and I believe one did get married and had a child. I reached out through Ancestry.com, and unfortunately have not been able to find that person. The email address was invalid. So I do know there is some ancestors, at least a ancestor. This was probably 5 or 6 years ago, and can't reach out to them or find them.
Yeah, it's always tough. David, are you with us? We'll move on to a question from Mark. Mark asks, he also commented, what a wonderful mystery, and I agree. Mark asks, have you been able to find any census data which might help clear up the name issue, and particularly the location of Mac?
No, nothing. I have gone through all the censuses for Canada and the United States trying to find information. Believe me, I've gone through a fine-tooth comb. I actually went to a Canadian in Manchester, New Hampshire. There's like a library of all kinds of Canadian history. And I spent a whole day up there and couldn't find anything, any records of even like a baptism or something of that nature. Couldn't find a thing.
Challenges abound. And let's see, another Allison asks on Facebook, do you know when Margaret Hale died?
Nope. I cannot find any record of her birth or her death, or obviously where she's buried. I would like to add one of the things I had to leave out is in the letters Frank sent is there seems to be an intent that she would marry him. And obviously as far as we know, she's married to York McLean. But in the letters, there is talk of next to Elmwood Farm, there's another house that George Herron bought and is like leasing to Frank Moore. And in the letters he puts about like Margaret's going to come down there and live with him in Metuchen, New Jersey. And that's in 1904. So I found that pretty interesting based on that. And if you realize she has the job offer then too, which is to go to Milwaukee, I would think she would have to be in Milwaukee. So I question that a lot. Where did she go? Did she go to Milwaukee? Did she could have ended up working for Eugene Debs, even for all I know, in Indiana. But he talks as if she's going to go down there and to New Jersey and live, and that they're going to get married. And there's several letters that mention that and talk about buying the land, and he talks about the house. And so just to, I forget what the question was, but to give a little more background of that mystery of like, where did she go? Because where did they bury her? When did she die? Did she end up marrying Frank Moore and her last name became Moore? I couldn't find anything else out about Frank either.
So many mysteries. Someone suggested maybe she changed her name again. If she did it once, maybe that could happen again. Marina said, intriguing story and great sleuthing on your part. Do you think that she deliberately kept a low profile for some reason, either due to fears of harassment or for the sake of her own daughter? Could this be why she isn't better known?
Yeah, and I think my personal opinion is part of it is, if you think of what it was like around 1900, if you were a woman, once you had a child, I think you were kind of pegged that you couldn't work, that you couldn't have a career, that you couldn't have a job, that your job was raising your child, and that you couldn't do anything beyond that. So I personally sometimes think, because you see what a solid career she had, I personally think that that's a part of her logic for keeping Dulcie hidden. Because also what I didn't mention was several of the letters, like that one letter I showed you, mentions Dulcie. So the people that were close to her knew about Dulcie. They knew that she had the daughter. They knew about that. But the people that were more, her, acquaintances, et cetera, don't necessarily know about Dulcie. And I think that she purposely kept that fact hidden, showing you, actually, that's why I showed you that letter from 1894. She obviously that attorney must have known that she wanted to keep her daughter hidden from the general public.
Julia wants to know about if you found any information from the Debs library or the Debs collection at Indiana State.
Yes, I did. What was interesting, which Allison helped me find, and she's aware of that, was that Eugene Debs, it was March of 1917, if I have the year correct, that Eugene Debs came to Boston, and he wrote, and there's a record of all the letters that Eugene Debs wrote or had, it's in with the museum. And he mentions that Margaret met him at the train station or whatever, and walked back with him to the hotel. And that was in March of 1917. So I know she was still alive then. And I do know that happened, but she kind of, like one article I have says that Margaret vanished into the midst of time. And that's how I feel. She just vanished in regards to being active with the Socialist Party and writing and stuff like that. Or she could have changed her name again, but Eugene Debs obviously knew her as Margaret Hale. And there's other proof that I think he knew that her real name was Isabel McLean too. I do think that Eugene Debs knew that.
Maybe one day you'll be able to clear up that mist for us, Cindy.
Yeah.
Just a couple more questions and we'll close out today. Wendy asks, how do you think the letters ended up at Linwood Street? She said Jim is asking.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how they ended up there, but my understanding is that the Casson family was very active with the Socialist Party, and that the property, so that where my grandmother lived across the street from property owned by the Casson family, and there was a lot of information that was kept there. And somehow the letters, where the house my grandmother bought, as we mentioned, there was a barn that was ripped down. And my understanding, from at least what my mother told me, is my grandmother had found those letters in an old trunk in that barn. And somehow that trunk must have gotten over into that barn. Maybe they knew the neighbors, and that I think Margaret was moving and she didn't, she probably thought she'd come back and get those letters, and that, just ask them to store them, is what my thoughts are. Because I know she boarded and stayed with the Casson family. I originally thought the Casson family owned the house that my grandmother bought, but I did do research and found out that no, they never actually owned that particular house. So I just think it was maybe a neighbor helping them out, and then it got left behind and got left there. It's the only thing I can figure that happened.
I guess that adds up. Allison also wondered if Mac could be a brother.
I guess Mac could be a brother.
Yeah, so that's our last question today. Uh, Thank you so much, Cindy, for this fantastic, really informative, and really relevant presentation about the life of Margaret Hale. Thank you to all of our participants, attendees here in Zoom and over on Facebook Live. Cindy has put contact information, her website, for you to see on the screen here. So feel free to reach out to Cindy if you have more questions about Cindy or think you have any leads, any tips that might clear up some of
Yep.
this mystery here too. And in the meantime, um, if you like programming like this, and if you want to see more programs like it happen in the future, please support the Debs Foundation and Museum over at donate.debsfoundation.org, and we'll be able to continue keeping the Debs legacy alive together. One more big thank you to everybody involved today, and stay warm out there and have a great rest of your weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.